what happened to the once popular Western genre. As a certain prospector doll once put it, once the astronauts went up, children only wanted to play with space toys. And yet the Western legend lives, often beyond the Earth and often mixed with the science fiction genre. What is a space Western? Today we invite ray gunslinger and After Moses sci-fi Western series author Michael F. Kane to ride into the studio.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Howdy, Pilgrim. This here's Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm me, Stephen Burnett, Lorehaven's publisher, and the author of a new science fiction adventure released just in the last month from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and you've probably heard of cowboys and Indian stories, and maybe even cowboys and aliens movies. I don't really recommend that one. But have you heard of cowboys and artificial intelligences? That's kind of what we're talking about today on episode 255, What Are Space Westerns? And we're going to be joined in a minute by author Michael F. Kane, who published After Moses.
My first Westerns that I enjoyed, Zach, were Earth Westerns, the traditional type, a very famous genre, kind of really starting with, I guess what they call them, the penny serials or the magazine articles, whatever they were. I think Westerns were actually popular first when the Old West was still being settled, but even into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, Westerns were still around, not just in the United States, but in other countries, and they're still here too, often being mixed, as we said, with science fiction genres, but still the traditional ones are around.
You know, I just realized, and I didn't even have this in the notes, but I think the very first sci-fi Western I watched was Back to the Future 3, where they time travel in a DeLorean to whatever it is, 1885 to the Old West. And, you know, he has this steampunk ice cube machine, and then obviously he's got the DeLorean. And I guess that would qualify. I don't know, but it's because it's time travel, so you're kind of cheating a little bit. But I think the book we're going to talk about is much more futuristic, where hey, we're in space, we're in the future, but also there's the Old West in a way.
There was an attempted sci-fi Western movie starring Will Smith in the late 90s. I just remember the toys and the marketing was everywhere,
Wild
and
West.
It flopped so hard. You remember the name. I just remember that it flopped, and suddenly everyone was making fun of it. And just this past weekend, as we released this episode, there's been a similar vibe about another movie, but hey, we're not talking about fairy tale remake attempts. We're talking about space Westerns. Zach, the domestic Westerns that I enjoyed were probably not the ones that other people remember, because for some reason, when I was growing up, my folks got some satellite TV in the house. It was our cable alternative where we were, and there was a dedicated channel just called Westerns. That was it. Wow. That was the name of the channel, and it did what it said on the Old West tin. It just was just Westerns 24/7. And you could catch reruns of The Lone Ranger on there, or The Rifleman, or some of these other series that were often, at least for The Lone Ranger, they were intended for an audience of kids. And then when we switched over to The Rifleman, wow, it was like going from Marvel cartoons to PG-13 rated DC movies. The Rifleman was intense sometimes, and I actually figured out, I enjoy these kind of darker stories where there's this widower who's on a ranch trying to raise his son and teach him how to be a man, and he has this special rifle that he can actually twirl around in the air as if it was a six gun. And there are bad guys that try to invade the ranch or the town, and he occasionally teams up with the sheriff. And it was a great show, despite the complete lack of spaceships or other sci-fi tropes. So we're going to get all of them as we move forward into this episode with our special guest, Michael Kane, who, no, he's not that Michael Kane, although If you want to watch Secondhand Lions, which is kind of a Western, you can see Michael Kane do his best Texas accent with limited success. Over at Lorehaven, we have a mission update. Reviews are back on the menu, boys. And we have had a review of Amanda Wright's fantasy Darkfell. Lots of people have been enjoying that review. We have another review coming up for Andy Dickinson's debut, Truth Cursed, just released a few months ago from Enclave. That review will release this Friday. Meanwhile, I decided that I wanted to go back and revisit a movie that I really enjoyed, a Disney remake that is actually fantastic. And that is Sir Kenneth Branagh's movie Cinderella from 10 years ago in 2015. That kind of gives the lie to the statement of no Disney remake is good at all. Well, some of them actually are pretty good. And I actually think that Branagh's Cinderella is better than the cartoon. Yeah, you can say what you want to.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to hate a Kenneth Branagh movie. I don't think I've seen a bad one.
No, and that's what I expected going in, was I expected Disney Cinderella by way of Kenneth Branagh. I don't know what other people expected, but I absolutely love it. It is made with, as I like to say, near Narnian aplomb. There's chivalry, there's color, there's sincerity, and an absolutely terrific cast. And I would hate for people to miss that just because the myth has gotten about that all the Disney remakes are bad. You can still have your cake and eat it too, though, because this film is terrific, and yet the critics hated it so much, hated the characterization of Cinderella because it messed with their political priors, that Disney apparently decided to do an about face and handle everything differently going forward. So if they'd stuck with the ethos of Branagh's Cinderella, I think they would have been much better, but they didn't. So here we are. But Cinderella is still fantastic, and you can catch my article about that this week of release at Lorehaven. And if you miss our updates at Lorehaven, you can subscribe free, and we will send you the updates you want every week. You can also join the Lorehaven Guild, because we'll send you the exclusive access code to that castle in the cloud on Discord, where we are moving forward with more book quests going into the spring. So if you want to keep up with some of the books we've been reviewing with a fantastic team of readers, Lorehaven Guild is the place you want to go. And if you want a fantastic audio drama to listen to this spring, that brings me to our first sponsor, top sponsor, back again, audio-epic.com with their 1232 podcast. This sponsored segment is presented by Oasis Family Media. Would like to present you with 1232, an exciting binge-worthy audio epic. From creators Callie Sue and Cheyenne Landry of Rumble Stump Entertainment comes a faith-in-action audio adventure for all ages. When the experimental research of a physicist goes awry, his estranged twin children follow him through time to medieval Wales in the year 1232 AD, where they come face to face with a brutal world filled with superstition and legends. Along the way, they meet a penniless leader, a dark sorceress, and a warrior priest who provoke the twins into confronting the truth about themselves, each other, and Jesus Christ. Season 1 of 1232 is available now wherever you get your podcasts or audiobooks. Start listening today to 1232 and visit audio-epic.com to begin the adventure. That is audio-epic.com. We'll also have that link in our show notes for this episode 255. Now, Zach, we have another segment that I didn't tell you about, but we need to start doing because we need to start planning for the Realm Makers Expo. So I just wanted to ask you and ask myself in front of these witnesses how your planning is going for going to this incredible event that is an expanded version of the Realm Makers Writers Conference. They're still going to have the Writers Conference, but they're also adding this amazing, huge vendor hall full of the best Christian fantastic creators to show their creations in front of a growing audience of fans. And that's going to be this July 18th through 20th at the DeVos Convention Center in Grand Rapids. So, Zach, are you ready to go? How's the preparation going for Realm Makers?
Yep, I will be there. I'll be bringing my daughter with me, and we're going to have a great time there. I was looking at a map of the vendor hall and all the different types of booths that authors and other vendors can get. And man, it's really impressive to see how many spaces there are. Now, I don't know how many are filled and who's all going to be there, but I love the ambition of it. I mean, it's like so many times bigger than the vendor space that we've had in previous Realm Makers conferences. So I think this could be the start of something really incredible, because I know a lot of other people that don't normally come to a fiction writers conference are already planning to come to this. And so, and that's just a few people I know. And I think that's going to represent just hopefully this wave of many types of Christian creators beyond novelists coming to this. Yeah, I'll be going to the writer's track, so I'll be popping into the Lorehaven booth here and there. Steve and I may even record this podcast live-ish from there. We'll see. We're not really sure what this year is going to be like, because also the other interesting thing, Stephen, I just remembered, is because they are going with this new format, they shifted the days a little bit. So now Sunday is going to be a full day at the conference, and they're going to start off with a worship session on Sunday morning.
Terrific idea.
I love it. I mean, I think it's something a lot of people have wanted for a long time. I think it's pretty standard at a lot of Christian writers conferences. And so I love that we're going to have that focus this year.
There will be a Lorehaven booth, as usual, at the conference. It'll be a little bit different, if for no other reason than it's going to be larger. It will also be effectively a combined Lorehaven space mission booth, because I, as a publisher of Lorehaven, I'm also promoting my Sci-Fi Above the Circle of Earth, which isn't a space western, but may have some thematic overlap. I'm really looking forward to being there now, not just as a Lorehaven publisher, but as a fiction author in my own right. And of course, we're going to have some fantastic neighbors at the conference. Some of our friends, Enclave Publishing, a lot of the sponsors of this show, Fantastical Truth, a lot of the authors we review at Lorehaven. Then I saw recently, Zach, that our friend Peter Franson of the Christian Geek Central YouTube channel is finally coming to Realm Makers. So he will be there as well. I'm looking forward to hanging out more with him. I don't think we've actually met in person, so this will be a first time. It's one of those people you feel like you've met in person, but you haven't really. Similar to our upcoming guest, Michael F. Kane, who, by the way, has chosen to crash into the studio aboard a meteorite. So while we phone in the damage for our meteorite insurance, let's welcome him. Michael F. Kane. It's not Michael Caine. It's Michael F. Kane. I'm sure you've never, ever heard that joke before, but welcome to the Lorehaven studio. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me on, Stephen.
Great to have you, Michael. Okay, now I did say in the opening, this is not a cowboys and aliens story, but I actually maybe got to ask, are there aliens in this? Is that a spoiler? What can you tell me?
There is not a single alien.
Oh, okay.
Then it's a Christian story.
I once asked my close group of beta readers what was the worst possible way that the central mysteries of After Moses could end, and they unanimously said aliens with the famous aliens gif.
Right. Well, I mean, it kind of has become the Deus Machina, hasn't it? Yeah.
Right. I am happy to confirm no aliens.
Okay.
Deus alien. Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Michael, as a person who also wrote a science fiction novel with no aliens inside, a very human-centered story. I think the more human you can make the science fiction, I think you get a little bit closer, not only to the acceptability level of more Christian readers who get a little nervous about aliens who are demons 100% of the time, every single case, but also you just stick a little closer to maybe some more human themes. You know, even the best alien stories are just, you know, people wearing prosthetics and makeup who are just sort of a stand-in for human beings. So I want to hear more about After Moses real quick, though. You started this in 2018, independent published. It was just the first novel, and now you got 4 more books in the After Moses series, correct?
Yes, 4 more. There are 5 totally published right now. Number 6 comes this year. Audio for the first book should be coming late this year at the same time as the series is finished. So that'll be a new adventure working through that end as well. But I am very looking forward to having this thing done. It'll be about 900,000 words. That's longer than the Bible by a good little chunk there. So it has probably been the biggest, let's say the biggest endeavor of my life, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
And I saw on X that you started selling direct, not only the physical copy, but the ebook copy. And that very much touches on an area that I'm passionate about, which is actually owning things that you buy. So, because Amazon has made that very difficult lately to actually own the ebooks that you buy through their system. You own a license to check them out essentially on an Amazon device that hopefully you don't ever forget the password for or get in trouble with Amazon for some reason. So, as far as I can tell, you actually let people own the ebooks to put on their own dang device and keep a backup copy of in case they lose that device, which has never happened to me before. So I love that you're doing that. I mean, you're truly an indie. Like you're on your you're very much like in the old spirit of the Old West. You've got your little storefront, there in that little town with the tumbleweeds blowing around. So that's really cool.
Yeah, I've been planning to roll out the storefront for the last year, but it's been one of those perpetual, okay, I'll get to it. I've got to get to it. I've got to get to it. But Amazon's recent clarifications in their licensing, really made it a hurry of, okay, let's go ahead and do this. So I had to very quickly switch where my website was hosted because I wanted a platform that had much more robust digital distribution. And so, you can get signed hardbacks directly from me. You can get the ebooks. I'll roll out some more stuff too. But absolutely, if you buy from me, you own it as far as I'm concerned. If you buy a hardback, a digital copy, an ebook comes just attached with it. You can have that for free. And I tell people, if you already own an ebook, you are free to give that extra digital copy to somebody else as a gift.
Now, how providential that you rolled out that storefront at the same time we were ready to have you on as part of our Martian Month series going throughout the month of March. Before we get started with chapter 1, I would like to know what led you into this mad journey. How did you discover not only fantastical imagination, but biblical faith in Christ?
Well, I was one of those church kids. I grew up in church. My dad was a deacon. I came to saving faith very early. But I grew up in a very well-read, literate family. My mother has better prose than I do, and she's one of my chief editors. The biggest arguments we've ever had is arguing over a line edit of a specific line that she thinks it would be better one way. So it's baked into the DNA. I found recently a project from, I think it was 4th grade, where we were writing little books and spiral binding them, and it was The Cats of Mars. And of course, it was hand illustrated, and I am not an illustrator. Never was, never have been. So sci-fi and faith have been my life the whole time. Through my 20s, I definitely kept trying. A lot of authors say they've got this one book that this is the story that's been rattling around in my mind for years, and I've got to get it on paper. Well, After Moses isn't that story. I tried multiple times to write through my 20s the story that's rattling around in my mind, and eventually gave up and decided I'm not good enough to write this story yet. And so I need to think of something else to write. And so over the course of about an hour, I kind of outlined some of the things that would eventually become After Moses. By a week later, the first chapter was on paper, and went from there.
So I'm curious whether you also grew up reading and writing Westerns, and that's the topic of chapter 1, because we're going to talk about putting two genres together, although I think, as we'll see, they're not quite apart as one might think. If we're talking about putting them back together, then we got to talk about what each genre entails. And the first one is the Western genre, which is not very fantastical at first, or is it? Sometimes you get some little mystical edge to the Western tropes. And that actually is probably one of the top genres I grew up watching, because also growing up Christian and as a homeschool kid, Christians in general and homeschoolers in particular have this habit of thinking that older is better. And I'm not knocking the habit. I'm just saying it is a fact that at least when I was growing up, there was this idea that classic entertainment is safer almost always. And Westerns is one of those, rerun prone genres that we watched a lot of on that Western channel I mentioned earlier. I mentioned watching The Lone Ranger, and then the edgier cousin for more grown-up viewers, The Rifleman, and a few others. And I'm sure there's a lot of Western movies that people grew up watching as well. We watched kind of the tame ones, like the singing cowboy varieties. I remember my brother once got like an entire VHS set of all, 11 Roy Rogers movies, which were kind of just basically the same movie remade over and over. It was Roy Rogers and his boys riding around saving a ranch or something, and then occasionally singing a song that the studio had the rights to. Really safe, kind of anodyne stuff, but relatively harmless, and very much the sort of thing that young lads enjoy. I mean, typically Westerns are associated as boys' adventure stories. And there is something fairly safe and traditional about these. And I think it's right that Christians can see some of these older stories as maintaining a kind of code, or at least the popular cultural version of a cowboy code, the sense of chivalry and good men ought to be self-sufficient and be able to ride off into the desert and take care of themselves, or settle down, have a family, buy a ranch, work the land. It's really good, basic biblical traditional stuff. And yet there are also some prestige and even some pulp stories, I understand, that push the limits of the genre, that try to test to see how much blood they can get away with on the screen, or show that there's actually a gray area to the lawman who's in charge of the town, that kind of thing. And I know I haven't watched them, but Westerns are still around. What is that series? It's one of the prestige streaming dramas. I think it's on Paramount. Yellowstone? I think people are loving Yellowstone, and either it's a modern one or an old one. I forget.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, or maybe push back. I haven't watched it, but I keep seeing the memes of Kevin Costner's character like in this like cowboy attire, but he's saying something more like politically liberal than like politically conservative. And so I'm like, wait, what is this show? Like, is it more of like the Old West traditional conservative, or is it more like modern or postmodern progressive? Because I don't know. I haven't seen it, but
can you even have a Western that's set in the modern era? I think you can.
I don't know. Yeah.
Can a Western have cars in it? I mean, the West is still there. People still ride horses and rope steers and such like. So I think it still counts as a Western. It's just a modern Western rather than a pioneer days, 19th century Western. So I don't know. Either way, I haven't seen it. I just know the genre is still around. Yeah.
Have you watched it, Michael?
I have not. I have not. And I'm only familiar with the arguments and the memes and the discourse around it. And it seems the more conservative end of things is a little split on Yellowstone.
I didn't really grow up reading these types of books that I can remember, but I definitely watched some Old West TV shows growing up. And, Stephen, you mentioned like a code, that there was the cowboy code. And I think that's really what
the code of the West or whatever, right?
Yeah. What is that? There was this very strict kind of moral code that everyone followed or was expected to follow. And then, of course, someone would disrupt that code, whether it's the sheriff turned bad, or whether it's an outlaw, or whether it's some other kind of threat to the town.
Aliens.
Aliens, right? That they'd have to defend against. And even though no one was there watching, like there was no like FBI, there was whatever, there was no big enforcement mechanism for this moral code, it would get enforced. And it's kind of interesting to think about that as opposed to something more like Mad Max, right? Where Mad Max is essentially the same setting. It's like, everyone's kind of dispersed and there's no central government or no powerful central government and very rudimentary technology. And yet somehow there's anarchy and cannibalism and all the horrible things. And there's also a lot of nihilism. There's not a lot of moral codes, but I mean, maybe some moral characters, but there's not that widespread understanding of this is how society should work. And yet it worked, like society worked in this Old West. So how did it work? And like, what makes this era so special?
So let me tell you something about what Mad Max is different, right? The Western, in some ways, is the American myth, right? It is the American myth of we started on the Eastern Seaboard. There's an entire continent that's only loosely populated. And it is dangerous, but there is high reward for pushing west and carving out little pieces of civilization along the way until the West is eventually won. It is deeply rooted in the American myth. Whereas Mad Max is the opposite. It's a similar setting, but it's a deconstruction about the fall of civilization, not the founding of civilization. So it's an opposite mythos in a way. Despite sharing that setting, that the trappings in the setting, it is philosophically diametrically opposed to the Western.
And it's probably a commentary on civilization itself, or the system will always go corrupt or something, but there's no overarching quest to build civilization. It's like, oh, the civilization is the problem, and then this is how it fell apart. And yeah, that's an interesting point, that there's a lot more optimism, obviously, in the Western. It's this idea that if we keep building, if we keep civilizing, like we'll have a better place to live. Like it's not going to be easy. Like you said, it's going to be very hard, but there was a hope and there was an end goal rather. Whereas with Mad Max or similar, it's just like, oh, you just have to survive. Like that's the only goal of like, just don't die. And then everything will be okay, I guess.
Yeah. My experiences with Westerns growing up, I probably read a Louis L'Amour book or two in the, that kind of junior high era. If you ask me to identify which one or two I picked up from the library, I could never do it, at this point. But my experiences with Western was that Saturday afternoon on the television, dad flipping channels, finds one and stops, which means that I can't identify most of the Westerns I ever saw because we missed the first 5 minutes and I never knew the title, right? So there's all these movies I can think of. It's like, oh, which one is this? I have no idea, until someone starts talking about, like, okay, yeah, I've seen that. What's the name of that? Good, thank you. Now I know the title of that movie. So, and I kind of think that's a lot of people's experience with Westerns, kind of the millennial experience with Western, because really by that time there weren't very many new Westerns coming out. But talking about, Westerns and their content and the American Western, there's another kind of Western that is a bit philosophically different, and that's the spaghetti Western. The spaghetti Westerns, where are they from? They were made in the 50s through about 70s, is they were actually made in Italy, or they were produced in Italy. I think a lot of them were actually filmed in Spain, but that's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. A lot of Clint Eastwood's Westerns were actually spaghetti Westerns, and the spaghetti Westerns were kind of the flip opposite of the John Wayne American Westerns that had these optimistic trends in them. The spaghetti Western is very often has this cynical trend through it. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a fabulous movie, right? It deserves its reputation. But even the good guy is running a con scheme at the beginning of the movie, right? They're always more murky. They're always more cynical. And one thing that you find is going forward, the spaghetti Western kind of begins to influence and corrupt the American Western, so that by the 70s, most of the Westerns that the Americans are making are no longer optimistic. You've got the cynical, dark, bloody take all the time, as opposed to the, like I said, really tapping into that American mythos of the taming the West.
Well, I want to ask in a couple of chapters, Michael, who Matthew Cole is more like, the grimdark, subversive spaghetti Western type, or somebody more like the Lone Ranger or Chuck Connor's character in The Rifleman. First, however, let's do a jump in genres for our second sponsor, which is Sunrise Publishing, with a new novel that is now available only in ebook form at the Sunrise Shop, but soon will be available everywhere. And that is Lord of Winter by Jill Williamson, presenting debut novelist Andrew Swearingen. This is book 2 in the Blood of Kings Legends series. After years of darkness, Eric Livna returns from the battlefield, ready to assume his new role as Lord of Softtown. His arranged marriage to Lady Viola has always lacked true affection, but Eric is now hoping to bridge the emotional distance between them. Viola, however, is quietly working on a plan to change things in Softtown, even if it means keeping secrets from her husband. When the ambitious Sir Fenris Yarden stirs up division in Softtown and wreaks havoc on the Livna's marriage, Eric and Viola must decide whether to let betrayal tear them apart or to unite against the forces trying to destroy them. Blood of Kings Legends continues in Book 2, Lord of Winter, from authors Jill Williamson and Andrew Swearingen. This second book is now available in ebook at the Sunrise Shop. Lord of Winter then releases everywhere on April the 1st, so just next week. Book 3, Lady of Shadows, releases in July, and both ebooks will release a month early at sunrisepublishing.com. So that is your one-stop Sunrise Shop, sunrisepublishing.com. You can also find those links and more info in the show notes for this episode 255, or for the whole podcast archive, Fantastical Truth. Go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Chapter 2. We've gone from the big skies and the rough men of Westerns to the more infinite skies and the rough men of science fiction. So this is where I risk repeating some of the material that Zach and I went over just an episode or two ago in episode 253, How Do Classic Sci-Fi Novels Explore the Planet Mars? Mars, as you know, has been key to the science fiction genre since its more modern incarnation started more at the turn of the 20th century. And at least in my distant reckoning, it seems that the Western genre led to the science fiction genre by way of Mars, because Mars, at least in the popular preconception, could have been this unexplored frontier out there, probably populated, probably with natives and guns and tribes and maybe some fantastical ships of some kind and other creatures you don't know about, similar to the Western tropes. So this to me seems to have been an expansion of what Michael called earlier, that great American myth of, well, we got to California, the gold rush is over, civilization is springing up, and we've conquered the West, or at least the white American settlers have conquered the West. And so where else are we going to go? Well, there's this rumor about the canals on Mars in space, and Mars is the closest planet. So maybe someday we'll go there. So you get John Carter, astral projecting himself to Mars, mainly by force of mystical will, where he finds a new land to explore. And it's basically a Western-ish on Mars, with maybe a little bit more politics, with cavalries and armies and adventure and exotic natives and everything. It's basically a Western in space. And then you get some similar tropes going throughout the literature there. Even Dune, just a little bit, has some of that Western edge, even though it's not like everybody's carrying around 6-shooters. It's more knives and giant Shai-Hulud worms and all of that. It's more about the dynasties and the politics and whether or not Paul Atreides is a hero or an anti-hero or a tragic hero or a villain, or however you interpret him. My interpretation is probably different from his authors, by the way. There's still, Western seems to have kind of gotten into the DNA there, at least as far as I can tell. So, Michael, I want to pass this over to you. With the science fiction that you read growing up, I'm curious how much Westerns seem to have informed or been the ancestors of those stories from authors like Asimov and Herbert.
It's there. As far as Asimov, you ask about Asimov, there's definitely in his short stories things that I would say fall into this. Less so in his novels, which I honestly am 100% convinced that Asimov was a better short story writer than a novelist writer. Hundreds of short stories, some truly excellent ones, more about the frontier and about, going out and settling in colonies and all sorts of stuff. With Herbert, that's interesting because I wouldn't really connect Dune too much with the American Western, simply because I feel there's a lot of the Lawrence of Arabia. There's almost more of the British adventure of colonialism in Dune that I can see. But again, it's that desert. It's the desert with the rundown towns makes it hard to totally separate. But what I was going to say is the one as a kid that the immediate Western influence for me is Star Wars.
Yeah.
Right. And Star Wars it's secondhand too, because you have the American Western, which strongly influences the Japanese samurai movie. Kurosawa is one of the most famous Japanese directors of a certain period who strongly influenced George Lucas. Lucas was always very straightforward in saying that Kurosawa was one of his biggest influences. Which one is it? Is it The Hidden Fortress or something like that he frequently references? And then from there, you go back to Star Wars, which has that Western influence, but it's been moderated by the Japanese samurai movie, where you have these knights with swords in the middle of the gunplay. But specifically, the first Star Wars movie is the most strongly Western of the series. You get Han Solo in the cantina, all the shady characters, backwater towns, kids in the middle of nowhere wanting to get off the farm. There's definitely that strong influence there.
Well, The Mandalorian brings it all the way back around. There are episodes of The Mandalorian which are just straight up Westerns. There's literally, I think it's the first episode of season 2, which is there's a monster out in the desert and there's a good sheriff in town. I actually liked him. He was or marshal or something. They may have actually even called him a marshal. And he's got guns and there's an office and there's a bar with the doors and there was the opening scene in Mandalorian, actually, season 1, episode 1, where he's a bounty hunter. He walks into the bar and the only difference is that the doors go swoosh instead of flip flap. And it's completely, or saloon rather. It's just a complete return to the Western, unapologetic way to go, Jon Favreau. I still like that, even though Disney's messed up Star Wars. Mandalorian seasons 1 and 2 are still awesome.
there's that classic line, I can bring you in warm or I can bring you in cold.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, that could come from just a traditional Western movie. It's perfect.
That's why I have a 12-inch tall Mandalorian on my desktop to this day. I still like the fella.
And I think that's partially why The Mandalorian is such a success, whereas a lot of other Disney Star Wars has obviously struggled, is because it is very at home and aware in a specific storytelling tradition.
Yeah.
Right? It's not trying to be a modern story or anything like that. It is aware of where its roots are. It's not trying to invert, subvert, or remake those roots. The first season of Mandalorian is just a straight up Western. You got the wandering gunslinger that no one really knows anything about, and he has to protect this kid, right? I mean, you could transplant that entire story perfectly into a more traditional Western, and it would work.
Especially the Disney sequels, we don't get this vision of like, how do you build a new galactic something? Like, they say, oh, there's the New Republic. Oh, but there's also a First Order. It's the new big bad. It's the new David versus Goliath. Underdog versus the evil empire. They didn't have an optimistic story like we've been saying, where it's like, how do we go out and build civilization? It's like, oh, they just kind of take it for granted. Oh, there is civilization, but it goes bad. And I want to draw a quote here from Beau L'Amour from this article from fictionalinfluence.com, the son of Louis L'Amour. And he has this really interesting quote here in the middle of the article where he says, science fiction died with Apollo, as in the Apollo moon landings. Once it was clear that getting anywhere from Earth demanded technology that could barely be imagined, the genre slowly began to morph into more and more dystopian, earthbound futures. And then he goes on to say cyberpunk seemed to be the nail in the coffin, which I'm like, oh man, shots fired, because I kind of like cyberpunk. But this is a really fascinating take here from someone that grew up in a very different era and who saw science fiction as originally this sort of Western-ish, optimistic, we're going to go out into the galaxy and we're going to settle all these planets and build all these towns and kind of stitch together a new civilization. And he said just the cultural awareness of like, we can barely get to the moon and we probably can't go much further than that. How in the world are we going to do this? And it's almost like people kind of give up hope of really going anywhere and really settling these other planets once they realize like what it would actually take. But I think there were some other cultural forces at work, because a lot of people today have commented on this, that so much of sci-fi is like the sci-fi horror. It in some variety. It's not always necessarily like Alien, where something's going to eat you or whatever, but it's sort of this idea that if we go out in space, it's just going to be horrors beyond your comprehension in some form or fashion, and therefore, like, why even try to go there? So it's too bad for what he kind of saw it change into. I think there's more to sci-fi than that, but I think he has a point that science fiction used to be much closer to the Western genre.
Yeah, I think that I really latched onto that quote too, because I was like, that's interesting, because I know what he's identifying. I'm not going to say that was when science fiction died, because it obviously doesn't. Although science fiction does go through a large popularity slump, kind of beginning around the 60s for quite some time. I think part of it is simply related to society begins to grow more pessimistic after the 50s in general. Right. And because so much science fiction is playing the game. Now, not all of it. You can have sci-fi, you can have historical science fiction set in the past if you want, but so much science fiction is playing a what if game that once society becomes more pessimistic, the questions you begin to pose, you start not liking the answers, which is why cyberpunk is almost entirely a cautionary genre. There is no part of cyberpunk that you look at and say, I want that to be the world I live in. It's like, well, okay, maybe you want cool prosthetics limbs, but that immediately gives rise to all sorts of, body horror and people getting body parts hacked. There's every aspect of cyberpunk comes with these enormous cautionary, you don't actually want this, right? And so a lot of science fiction becomes that, and all these different subgenres of science fiction, when we look forward and say, man, civilization has a lot of problems. How do we handle these things going forward? And when you live in a pessimistic time, the answer is not very well.
So that interview with Beau Lamore was fascinating, not just for a behind-the-scenes glimpse about his theories regarding how publishing has basically drifted away from trying to reach male readers, giving rise to the myth of, well, men don't read. Of course, my answer to that is, like, men do read. They just, when they do read, they read a lot of nonfiction and a lot about politics and theology and philosophy and things like that, or they're listening. Men are listening to audiobooks, basically with podcasts or with audiobooks proper. And so if you can get your book to turn into an audiobook, the chances are men are going to read, because a lot of men, like myself included, we like to read while we're doing stuff, not just sit there and read a book, although I enjoy that too. Men do read. Men have read Westerns, but an element kind of missing from that interview as well is the idea that there's more television shows now. Men may be enjoying their stories in different way, just like women are, by way of the little TV screen that you have in your pocket at all times. Like, how much has that interfered with the reading habit? Whereas back then, before even the advent of television, all you could do was read a book or read a magazine or something, if you had a long train ride or plane ride or something. And then even when television came around, all you had was your giant set, if you could afford it, at your house. You couldn't take that with you. So certainly new technologies have interfered with men's reading, but also tastes in genre. Certainly the tastemakers and the publishers, as Beau Lamore points out, have just gradually moved away from that direction. But men do still read. Men will read, by the way, books like Michael F. Kane's After Moses, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. By way of sponsor 3, final segment of the day here, Fragments by J.A. Webb. Speaking of science fiction and speaking of dystopian, the world ended, but its masters remain. The year is 2158. Civilization has collapsed, but from the ashes, the order has emerged, not as a savior, but as the unseen power that has ruled all along. Truth is a relic, dissent is a death sentence, and Fragments by J.A. Webb is a gripping tale of power, deception, and the courage to seek truth. Perfect for fans of dystopian thrillers like 1984, Brave New World, and The Da Vinci Code, but with a Christian twist. If you like stories of faith, defiance, and the battle against unseen tyranny, you'll love Fragments, Book 1 of the Seekers series. It is on Amazon, and it is especially at jawebauthor.com. That is web with 2 B's. You can see that cool cover and more info in the show notes for this episode 255. Now we come to chapter 3. The powers combined of the Western plus science fiction leads to the space Western proper. We've already mentioned a few examples like Mandalorian Season 1 and a fair chunk of Season 2. I was actually thinking, Michael, about Star Trek, and I realized, you don't see a lot of Western in Star Trek. I know it was originally described as a wagon train to the stars, and then maybe you have some genre inspirations for some of the newer series. Like, for example, I think they compared DS9 to more of the later Western shows, where it wasn't, City of the Week, Outlaw of the Week, but it was, all right, let's park here. This will be more like Gunsmoke. Let's park here in one town, and then, except for the battles in the later seasons, we'll have everything come to us, more of the U.S. Marshal in a town sort of approach. So those genres are still informing the ethos of a series like Star Trek, but Star Trek kind of, I think, survives by encompassing all those different kinds of Westerns, or all those different kinds of science fiction, I mean. You'll have the more optimistic kind, obviously shaping almost all of it, certainly in the earlier series. But then you'll also have some cyberpunk here and there. You'll have a monster hiding in the bulkheads. You'll have a whodunit mystery. You'll have something pessimistic. You'll have a deconstruction. You'll have a reconstruction. It's all over the place because it's more about the characters and the setting and the world building with these different genres kind of playing out from week to week with those episodes. But I don't remember any space westerns. For that, you had to go to either Mandalorian or, of course, people think about Cowboy Bebop. That's a famous a Japanese anime space western. And then there was, of course, the 14 episodes of Firefly and the movie Serenity. And then I would say, even though it flopped, Solo, a Star Wars story, has a great train robbery and everything. So that's another one of those that, I know, I like that, right? And I thought the guy did a great job as Han Solo, too. So it shouldn't have flopped, but it was probably The Last Jedi's fault there. But those are all movies. Those are all TV shows. Beau L'Amour was talking about all these Louis L'Amour books on the Western side, which are still like fairly popular. I watched a lot of shows, by the way, but my wife read like dozens of those books growing up because she had a cool dad who really enjoyed them. And so she's read more Westerns than I will ever see. And so there's still books that deal with this subject, the space Western in particular. I think even Louis L'Amour attempted some sci-fi here and there. But this is the current favorite of this episode is the After Moses series from Michael F. Kane. The first book was published some years ago, but we reviewed it at Lorehaven, book 1, After Moses. This is the cutaway quote from that. Michael F. Kane's novel After Moses follows its likable hero into a solar system that's struggling to survive after AI collapses and humanity grows corrupt. Kane fuses themes of grace and redemption into this sci-fi story with a classic Western feel. So, Michael, by the way, you have like the perfect Western author name, by the way. I assume that's your real, that's just a good one. And so is your hero of After Moses. I had it right here. Matthew Cole, quintessential freelance cowboy with a mysterious past. You want to just tell us more about this story, and particularly the post-AI trope that you seem to have caught up to early, several years before we had the large language models leading to real-life AI today.
Yeah, you would think I would be able to market this better considering it's perfectly timed, but I'm still working on that. So that was really when I mentioned earlier about how I sat down and very quickly kind of penciled out this universe. That was the first detail was, okay, we're used to super AIs. We're used to artificial general intelligence being the villain. What if the AI was genuinely benevolent? Is that still good for humanity? And the answer I come up with was no, not really, because it leads to people offloading their own intellectual and creative capabilities to machinery, right? Ultimately to machinery. We start going, I could figure this out, but it would take me a while. I'm going to let you do this, right? And so the backstory of After Moses that I quickly penciled down was, well, this artificial intelligence pops up on the scene named Moses, calls himself Moses, has no idea, no one has any idea where it comes from, quickly basically reorganizes all world economies and political stuff to keep it from going into a collapse setting, and says, we're all going to get along. We're all going to go to the stars. I'm going to lead you to a new promised land, Moses. And Moses is around for a century. And I in the story, I tell the backstory through all these epigraphs, these chapter opening quotes, in-world quotes. And I start off treating the Moses century as a golden age. But as it goes on, I start to slowly peel back and reveal it more as a gilded age, that, well, Moses couldn't really change humanity's nature. He could forcibly stop wars, but nations still quietly kept their nuclear reserves just disconnected from any networks that Moses could get to them, right? And people still have this. They're still humans. There's still this sin nature that Moses couldn't overcome. And so after a century, Moses disappears. Error message show up on every computer through the solar system. We've colonized the solar system. He's gone. Nobody knows why, and that leads to immediate collapse. So Earth starts fighting again. Earth goes silent. All the colonies out in the solar system just stop hearing from Earth when Earth basically goes to war. Full Kessler syndrome in the orbit. If you've seen the movie Gravity, space junk creating space junk creating space junk. Earth's cut off. Nobody goes there. Nuclear winter. It's just the colonies left for themselves, using technology that they didn't invent, barely understand, so begins a century-long decline. And so the story starts a century after Moses disappearing, and so that's why I immediately settled on, okay, this is a sci-fi Western. Because we have dusty backwater towns, we've got isolated frontiers, we have people struggling to survive. It's like, okay, this is a sci-fi Western I'm writing.
First of all, I love how you started this with this AI that comes out of nowhere and sort of takes over everything, because that is, from what I've read about how artificial general intelligence could become artificial super intelligence, that's kind of what is predicted, that it could literally be like overnight that this happens, that it could, I think the term is takeoff, that takeoff could be minutes, hours, days. It could happen so fast because of the exponential growth curve. And so that was, the fears of in movies like Terminator, Skynet, just taking over the entire military of every country in the entire world and annihilating everyone. But in this case, it doesn't annihilate everyone. It simply annihilates our intelligence of our own and our inability to function without it. And I think you've really hit on something there. And there's two quick stories I think that illustrate this well. First of all, I think we've all been in a situation where we've been using Apple Maps or Google Maps, and then we don't get a signal, or we accidentally end, or for some reason end directions, and we try to start it up again. And we're like, oh wait, I don't have a signal. It's not working. How do I get from here to where I need to go? Oh, I don't even have a paper map anymore in my car. How am I supposed to drive? And there was a story a few years ago where when Apple was rolling out its own version of maps, there were all these random bugs that someone had. And these people in the basically went into the Australian outback. They were not trying to go into the Australian outback. They were just trying to get to the next city or whatever. And they went on this huge detour, ran out of gas. They were in a totally isolated area and then no way to get out. So a very tragic story. And then also here where I live, we had a major snowstorm years ago. And there was, afterwards, there was this huge loss of water from our city water plant. And what it turned out to be was a valve that no one knew where it was and how to close it and whatnot, because this skill had basically been lost to the previous generation of workers that had known this system that is like 100 years old or something. And now we're used to everything being online. Well, this valve was not online. It was like literally you had to go find it in this water treatment plant. And so because of that, there was a major disaster in our city. So I think you're definitely hitting on something. Now, what I want to ask you though is, are you making something that's still more in that optimistic category, or is it something more in the cyberpunk category? Is it somewhere in between those?
So the story and the setting is a pessimistic decline in a way, but the characters are not.
That's what I was reading from our review, which gives me hope, because I want to see more optimistic heroes in a world like this. That is so my vibe. And Matthew Cole having apparently this code, and then what is it here? He ends up on a mission with a motley crew. Like, what's the plot of After Moses? Without giving spoilers.
Well, so Matthew Cole is very much the Western gunslinger who walks into town, who you don't know anything about, this mysterious guy with a past, right? He's the main character, but he's also the character that I hide the most about. You don't learn about what makes him tick for the longest. I frequently hear people say, oh yeah, I just picture Clint Eastwood. Right? I just picture Clint Eastwood for Matthew Cole, a young Clint Eastwood, But you find out very quickly that, Matthew Cole is the gunslinger with the heart of gold. Right. That he is very principled, far beyond what you would expect. And because it's this period of decline, he's had this ship and this spaceship that he's a freelancer. He does missions for hire, and he only takes ones that he thinks are above the board and things like that. But because of this decline, it's getting harder and harder for him to make ends meet, harder for his broker to find jobs for him. So he eventually starts, kind of against his will, collecting this crew. And a large part of this first book is really collecting this crew of odd misfits, and them getting to know each other, figuring each other out, learning to trust each other, and becoming the eponymous space family, the misfits on a ship. So the first person he meets is Abigail Sharon, who is a woman in a 7-foot powered armor. So another little quirk of the setting is occasionally you run into Earth Tech. And Earth Tech comes from somewhere on Earth where there's rumors that somebody is still keeping a higher technology level. But you got to know somebody that knows somebody in order to get a hold of any Earth tech. So occasionally I'll pop up with some little bit higher technology. So there's this woman in a 7-foot suit of armor with a shield. She's the shield maiden of Mars, right?
Oh, I love it.
And they start off the first mission that they run into each other. They're adversarial, right? In the second chapter, they're both hired. They're against each other. And the very next chapter, they're both hired on the same side, and they've got to work together. And they're protecting a prisoner transport on a train across the Martian wasteland. Very, very Western, fighting on the top of a train. And so there's this kind of series of events where Matthew was forced to pick up these people on his ship that, well, now he's got a widowed middle-aged doctor who is on the run from organized crime. She's crossed some mobsters, has a bounty on her head, and Matthew's going to take her onto his ship. And later on, the last pair, and this was always the riskiest pair. There's the 12-year-old girl and her adopted 17-year-old brother. They both grew up on the street and then were sold into slavery, and Matthew and Abigail rescue them from slavery. It's always risky having the kid because the kid can be annoying. But the 17-year-old boy, he is obnoxious at the start. When you start reading, he's going to be your least favorite character. By the end of the fourth book, most people say he's their favorite character because I use this obnoxious kid who grew up badly, who basically his only goal in life is protecting his sister. He's going to do anything to protect his sister, right? He gets all sorts of tough love from Matthew. There's a lot of this masculine mentorship of, no, you're going to do the right thing. I'm going to expect you to do the right thing. And so this kid grows up, and I perform this cardinal sin. I've had people tell me, I hate it when authors remove the main character from a book and they let it focus on somebody else. Well, I got to do that because how do I let this kid, Davy is his name, how do I let this kid really prove that he's become a man, except removing Matthew for most of a book and letting him show what he's learned and who he's become over these last few years. So really, a lot of it is about this crew that travels together, taking on these odd jobs that slowly get, more related to the grand mystery of what happened to Moses. There's this grand mystery of what happened to the AI that started all this. They slowly get wrapped up into some stuff like that, but it's very character focused. There's very much a responsibility of, despite the times you live in, you still have a responsibility to do what you can to make them better, to be a better person, to have responsibilities and take care of the responsibilities of the people around you and make the world better.
Now, I am loving what I hear more and more here, Michael. I'm curious about the name of the AI being Moses and this whole promised land motif. There's an idea here of the law, and that's kind of an intrinsic theme to the Western genre is lawmen and law and order versus, being outlaws and disorder. And so it can be very much almost a legal genre, almost a procedural where you've got to have what's right win out over what's wrong. And I've been thinking about this more and more in regard to Christian-made fiction or wholesome fiction or whatever, and how much you can say, oh, well, this novel is Christian, this story is Christian, if it doesn't have like some gospel of grace presentation in it. And I think this really comes down to the expectations of Christian fans who expect every story to be about some specific gospel presentation, when even God himself in the Old Testament, the Old West of its day, a frontier to explore and to civilize, it's all about, back then, it's all about the law. It's all about God's law and the moral order and training and responsibility and right winning out over wrong. And all of this training for God's people in the Old Testament before Jesus even arrives, before the gospel of grace arrives. So how much of that in a story can help readers get a hold of, even from a second and third degree, God's nature being a God of order over disorder, or a God of law over lawlessness? Like, I think that is a good thing for Christians and other people to think about, to flesh out through storytelling, often before we get hold of the saving gospel of grace. There's nothing wrong with spending a little time on the law side of things, just learning how things ought to be before the law breaks us. And then we realize, oh, we can't match up. We can't be that perfect, steely-eyed lawman all the time because we got the sin in us. We need a savior. But you're not going to get there without going through some law, whether it's in the Old West or on another planet or wherever.
In my case, what I use Moses for largely is that idea of a deliverer. There's this, we live kind of in a pessimistic time where we feel that, there's a lot going wrong with the world. And so there's this deliverer that shows up on the scene. And then, there's this failure of a deliverer here in Moses, and hence after Moses, the era we live in. But you talked about, this gospel presentation sort of thing. It's like, right, there's not a gospel presentation, although there are spiritual themes wrapped, deeply through all of them. I mean, I'll spoil the minor thing is that, Matthew is a deeply religious man. He's Catholic. He has a deep past with this of some things that have gone wrong. But each of the stories kind of takes some different aspects of spirituality. The second book is after Moses Prodigal, and I'd have this very long analogy about love, prodigal, the prodigal son leaving and love saying that's okay. The third book, Wormwood, is a lot about grief and mourning and bitterness. How hard it is to move on from those things. So there's a lot of spiritual things in there, and there's some people that if you're paying attention, they do become Christians, but that's not what the story is about. It's a story about Christian people living in a hard time, not a story about how they become Christians, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of story I really like to read. I like to know how do other people survive or thrive or, deal with these very difficult situations, because what if I'm going to live through something, maybe not exactly like this, but what if I'm going to find myself in a situation I couldn't imagine that I would face before? Like, what would I do in that sort of situation? And I think there's a lot of universal themes you've touched on there, like grief and, kind of forming a family or stitching a family back together. And so I think that's going to appeal to a lot of readers. And yeah, I like that you have just kind of an unapologetic hero that you said that the gunslinger with the heart of gold. I think that's probably what separates the optimistic versus the pessimistic fiction. As much as I say I like cyberpunk, there's actually quite a bit of cyberpunk I don't really enjoy. I mean, the classic one everyone, drools over, William Gibson's Neuromancer, I found it very tedious because there's really no good guys in it. I mean, the only character I got excited about was the random samurai that shows up towards the end of the book because he slips through all this security controls, and he's just a whisper away from beheading some guy with his sword that he keeps somewhere. And I didn't really like any of the main characters and maybe you're not supposed to like them. And that's what I kept going back to. Like, I think I'm supposed to hate everyone in this story. The AI character is kind of cool, but that's not really the point either. So, yeah, if that's the kind of cyberpunk that people think of, well, I think there's much better cyberpunk out there, even though that is the, supposedly foundational text in the genre. But I like what you're doing, Michael. I can see how this would apply or appeal to a lot of male readers, because I think men really, any guy that's working in a job has an optimistic view, right? Because he's thinking, look, I'm building something for the future. I'm building something for others, for my kids, for my community, for my church, whatever. And if they're working a job, it shows that they're investing right into the future, to a future hope. And I think especially as Christians, we do have reason to be optimistic, whatever is going to happen before Christ returns. But I think that the age of pessimism, I think, is over. I think the cynical, deconstructive tropes are just not landing anymore. And I kind of wonder if they ever really did land, or if it was just like a phase everyone kind of goes through of like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if we just like make fun of everyone and everything all the time? And now it's like, you know what? I've kind of grown up past that. So, yeah, I think having characters that are trying to build something, trying to rescue people, that's a smart move, because that's what men want to do at their core.
And you know what? I'll spoil the end of the story. It's a pessimistic setting, but the good guys win.
And that's what I want to hear. Even though you had me with the whole idea of a train across Mars, with folks trying
Very
to
cool.
fight on top of it. Yeah, that's just I'm kind of a sucker for that. I know everybody does that, or I think even Tom Cruise has done that.
Mhm.
Indiana Jones has done that. I don't care. It's a cool setting. And then every once in a while, oh no, the train is heading toward the tunnel. Who's going to duck first, and then who's going to get knocked over the side of the train to their doom, or possibly over the trestle. I would hope you have at least one Martian trestle there, Michael. Well, I too am really interested in what you're doing here. I'm going to have to pick up my own copy of After Moses, which, as you mentioned, you have your own store now. Can you give us your website and some info on what exactly is available there for folks to check out, as you yourself are doing the independent lone author thing, riding off into the sunset?
Sure. If you got to get it on Amazon, you can find me on Amazon either by searching After Moses or michaelfkane.com. That's not Michael F. Kane. Searching on Amazon at Michael F. Kane, Kane. I'm sure you'll have that in the notes. But on my website, that's michaelfkane.com. Right now, you can get hardback copies and ebooks. I'm going to be getting paperbacks, print-on-demand paperbacks coming fairly soon. There's a couple fun little merch options, too, that I'll expand as time goes on as well. But you can get them direct from me if you want. I make a little more. I try and make it a little cheaper, too, when I can. But yeah, you can get it direct from me if you want at michaelfkane.com. I appreciate it, and hope you'll consider picking up a copy.
Absolutely. And do you have a release date or frame for book 6 coming out to finish the series?
Fall. We'll just say fall right now. I don't have an exact date.
Fall of 2025. Okay. Any titles to give out?
Yeah, After Moses, Evensong is the title of the last book.
Now, that does not sound deconstructive at all.
Not in the slightest bit.
Downright poetical, fantastical. So, Michael, so great to have you. Best of God's blessings on your career. Watch out for outlaws and deconstructionists alike, and Godspeed to you and yours.
Thank you.
Well, to you, our listener, we want to know, what are your favorite classic Westerns or space Westerns? So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com. You can also leave a comment on this episode page that you can find at lorehaven.com, or find us on just about any social media while they still exist before the AIs sort of take over everything. And we got a note from our last episode, 254, from Ted. And Ted wrote to us about our discussion between dragons and spaceships and said, quote, "Okay, Steven and Zach, Star Wars nerd incoming. The Millennium Falcon is a heavily modified YT-1300. She's equipped with 2 quad-bolt cannons, ventral and dorsal, and 8 concussion missile racks. In addition, she can deploy a ground buzzer blaster cannon to cover escapes," unquote. You know, that does actually make it sound more like a dragon, Steven. So and having a name like the Falcon, I know that's a bird, and the Falcon or a dragon is what, a reptile. So yeah, a little bit different genus. And of course, we're talking about technology versus organic creatures, but it is a pretty cool way to think about the spaceship as designed after a dragon. So in that way, I guess dragons kind of win, because we're still trying to make things that mimic them and overpower them.
I disagree with Zach. Dragons did not win because by the providence of God, on the day of release for this episode, there was a space capsule, a return from the International Space Station, one of those SpaceX jobs, carrying on board the long marooned on the space station astronauts. But what was it? Butch Williams and Sonny. No, it was Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams. Yes, terrific names for astronauts, by the way. They finally splashed down to Earth, and the capsule, the spaceship, was named Dragon.
The Dragon.
So that's the winner of the contest between spaceships and dragons. Is a spaceship named Dragon. But I will note, however, that Crew Dragon did not have any offensive capabilities whatsoever. So if there were any outlaws in orbit, they would have been absolutely helpless. So you got any further thoughts on spaceships versus dragons, send your notes to podcast@lorehaven.com or tag us on the socials. Just look for Lorehaven on Facebook, Instagram, or X. Next on Fantastical Truth, As I mentioned, at least one astronaut who is a Christian, Butch Wilmore, recently splashed down in that Dragon capsule with Crew 9. But that makes me think, well, how many Christians have not only gone to space, but written about space, specifically the planet Mars? Where do we see Christian-made stories above the circle of Earth set on the planet Mars? We will journey back to recap the few Christian-made Martian stories that we've found and that you may have missed over the last years. As you head into that frontier of books, don't go looking for particular books like the ones we find at Target. There was an internet meme a little while ago where a guy went to Target and he said, "Hey, I didn't find the books I like here. What gives?" Instead, find them from indie authors like Michael F. Kane. Find them at Lorehaven, where we are reviewing the best Christian-made fantastical novels that we have found now every week at lorehaven.com. Join the mission. Look for books in those out-of-the-way backwater places where sometimes you will find surprising virtue as we continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.